What's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into a brand new HFY cinematic universe. This story is a wild ride about a creature that could swallow stars but chose to follow a single man instead. If you love stories where humanity's heart outweighs its firepower, do me a huge favor. Smash that like button, drop a comment with your favorite sci-fi trope, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of this epic saga. Let's get straight into section 1. The sky over Aegis Prime didn't scream, it simply dimmed. Commander Elias Thorne stood on the observation gantry of the Bastion Command, his mechanical hand rhythmically clicking against the cold titanium railing. Below him, the frantic machinery of war was in full, desperate motion. 12 regiments of the Colonial Defense Force were scrambling to their batteries, and the orbital comms were a jagged mess of panicked status reports. The Krell hegemony was 3 days out, their jagged, obsidian ships expected to blot out the suns. But the Krell weren't why the sky had turned the color of a fresh bruise. High above the atmosphere, drifting with a grace that defied its impossible mass, was the Void Shrike. It was a bioorganic anomaly the size of a tectonic plate, a jagged spine of iridescent scales and pulsing veins that seemed to drink the light of the binary stars. It had appeared out of a fold in real space an hour ago. It hadn't fired a weapon. It hadn't transmitted a demand. It simply was. Elias watched through his thermal monocle as a wing of star furies roared past the gantry, their engines vibrating in his chest. They loosed a full volley of tactical nuclear missiles, the kind of ordnance designed to crack a moon. The flashes were blinding, a sequence of miniature suns blooming against the Shrike's flank. When the radiation cleared, Elias felt a hollow chill settle in his marrow. The creature hadn't even flinched. There were no scorch marks on its translucent hide, no debris, no reaction. It didn't treat the human attack as a threat, it treated it as weather. It was a god-tier predator that had deemed an entire planetary defense force unworthy of its attention. "Commander, General Vance is demanding an immediate tactical assessment," a voice crackled over Elias's shoulder. It was Lieutenant Kale, a young officer whose eyes were wide with the kind of terror that only comes from realizing one's own insignificance. "Tell the General the assessment is simple," Elias said, his voice gravelly and low. "We are ants trying to bite a mountain. We should stop firing. All we're doing is wasting the ammo we'll need for the Krell." "But sir, it's sitting right in our gravity well. If it moves a fraction closer, the tidal shifts will level the coastal cities," Kale protested. Elias didn't look away from the beast. He had spent 20 years in the vacuum and he had developed a sense for intent. You didn't survive the frontier by ignoring the body language of the things that tried to kill you. Most monsters had a hunger, a rhythm of aggression. This thing felt different. It felt like it was listening for a sound that hadn't been made yet. The afternoon wore on in a state of suffocating tension. The military high command continued to throw everything they had at the Shrike. They used kinetic penetrators, localized EMP bursts, and even experimental graviton beams. Each time the result was the same: total indifference. The Shrike drifted through the armies of humanity like a whale through a cloud of krill, its massive bioluminescent eyes, each one the size of a stadium, staring blankly into the deep dark of the system. Elias found himself wandering away from the tactical displays and toward the edge of the docking bays. He felt a strange, magnetic pull, a resonance in his teeth that grew stronger as he approached the hangar doors. He watched as a final, desperate attempt was made. A heavy cruiser, the Cyanus Valiant, tried to ram the creature's lower ventral fin. The Valiant hit an invisible barrier kilometers away from the hide and crumpled like a tin can, its reactor core venting blue fire as it spiraled away. The Shrike didn't even twitch. "It's not ignoring us because it's cruel," Elias whispered to the empty hangar. "It's ignoring us because it doesn't know we're alive." He realized then that the military was looking at the Shrike as a ship, a target to be neutralized. They were communicating in the language of violence, a language the Shrike evidently found beneath its notice. Elias looked at his own reflection in the hangar glass. He was a man defined by his scars, a leader who had buried more soldiers than he had saved. He knew what it was like to be so weary of conflict that the world became a blur of noise. On a sudden, feverish impulse that ignored every protocol in the handbook, Elias stepped toward a localized scout ship, a tiny single-seat dart, used for short-range hull inspections. It had no weapons, no shields, and a signature so small it was practically invisible to radar. "Commander? What are you doing?" a technician shouted as Elias climbed into the cockpit. "I'm going to go say hello," Elias replied, sealing the canopy. He didn't wait for clearance. He punched the ignition and drifted out of the depressurizing bay. The dart was a speck of dust compared to the Valiant, and a microscopic germ compared to the Shrike. Elias steered the craft away from the frantic, explosive chaos of the fleet and began a slow, steady climb toward the creature's primary sensory cluster. As he cleared the atmosphere, the scale of the entity became soul-crushing. The scales were actually crystalline forests and the veins were rivers of glowing plasma. He flew past the wrecks of ships that had tried to fight it, seeing them lodged in the Shrike's passive gravitational field like bugs on a windshield. He slowed the dart to a crawl, matching the Shrike's orbital velocity until he was floating just a few hundred meters from one of its massive, multifaceted eyes. The eye was a deep, swirling amber, filled with galaxies of shifting light. Elias didn't lock his weapons, he didn't have any. Instead, he did the only thing he could think of to signal individual presence. He toggled the dart's external floodlights in a rhythmic, steady pulse. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. The universal cry for help. For a long minute nothing happened. The void remained silent. Then the amber depths of the eye shifted. A pupil the size of a mountain range dilated, focusing with agonizing slowness until it centered directly on Elias's tiny cockpit. The hum in Elias's teeth turned into a vibration in his skull, a sound like 1,000 cellos playing a single mourning note. The Shrike didn't attack. It didn't move. But for the first time since it had entered the system, the creature tilted its massive head, its focus sliding away from the armies of Earth and locking onto the solitary man in the tiny glass bubble. Elias held his breath, his hand trembling on the flight stick, realizing that the most dangerous thing in the universe was finally, terrifyingly, looking back. The weight of the creature's gaze was not a physical pressure, yet Elias felt his ribs groan as if the vacuum itself had developed a sudden, crushing gravity. Inside the cramped cockpit of the dart, the instruments began to fail in a rhythmic, pulsing cadence that matched the flickering amber light of the Shrike's eye. Digital displays bled into static, and the life support hummed a discordant tune that vibrated through the soles of Elias's boots. He was a speck of carbon floating before a primordial god, a momentary flicker in a consciousness that likely measured time in eons rather than seconds. He forced his hands to remain still, resisting the mammalian urge to flee, and maintain the steady rhythm of his signal lights. Through the silence of the void, a sensation began to bleed into his mind, not words but a profound, aching cold followed by a warmth that felt like a dying sun. It was a sense of recognition so ancient it bypassed his linguistic centers and struck directly at his primal instincts. The Shrike wasn't just looking at him, it was scanning the architecture of his intent. In the tactical displays of the fleet miles below, Elias was likely a suicidal fool, but in the presence of this titan, he felt stripped of his rank and history, reduced to the singular essence of a being that dared to ask, why instead of, how much? The dart gave a violent lurch as a primary coolant line ruptured, victim to the intense localized distortion field surrounding the Shrike. Alarms screamed in a shrill, dying tone, and the cabin temperature began to plummet. Elias checked his readings. He had minutes before the reactor bypassed its safeties and turned his tiny vessel into a tomb of frozen iron. The proximity of the creature was warping the very laws of physics his ship relied upon. He had no choice. He checked the seal on his environmental suit, grabbed a magnetic tether, and initiated the emergency airlock cycle. Stepping out into the open vacuum was an act of madness. The Shrike loomed like a jagged continent of obsidian and light, its surface a chaotic landscape of shifting plates and glowing apertures. Elias moved along the exterior of the dart, his movements sluggish in the pressurized suit, his eyes never leaving that massive, swirling amber orb. As he worked to patch the coolant leak, a new light appeared on the horizon of the Aegis Prime system. It was a sharp, aggressive crimson, the signature of a Krell Vanguard squadron. The Krell had arrived early. 3 jagged, needle-shaped interceptors dropped out of warp, their sleek hulls bristling with plasma lances. They ignored the Shrike, likely assuming it was a dormant celestial phenomenon, and focused on the only active human signature in the high orbital range, Elias. To the Krell, he was a scout to be eliminated before the main invasion fleet arrived. To Elias they were a death sentence he couldn't outrun. He watched as the lead Krell ship pivoted, its prow glowing with the buildup of a high-energy discharge. He was tethered to a dying ship, suspended in the dark, completely defenseless. He didn't close his eyes. He looked instead at the Shrike, a silent plea forming in the back of his mind, not for his own life, but for the recognition of the spark he had tried to share. The Krell fired. A bolt of searing red plasma tore through the darkness, aimed directly at the dart's exposed reactor. But the hit never landed. Space itself seemed to fold in front of Elias. The shrike didn't move its massive body, but a single crystalline spine on its outer ridge vibrated with such intensity that the vacuum seemed to shatter. A ripple of distorted gravity caught the plasma bolt, bending it 90 degrees and flinging it harmlessly into the depths of space. The Krell interceptors scrambled, their pilots likely screaming in confusion as their sensors went haywire. They adjusted their formation, turning their full arsenal toward the shrike, perceiving the first sign of life from the entity as a threat to be neutralized. They unleashed a barrage of fusion torpedoes. Each one was a city killer, a masterpiece of destructive engineering. As the missiles streaked toward the shrike's flank, the creature's eye didn't drift toward the attackers. It remained locked on Elias, who was still clinging to the side of his ship, his breath hitching in his throat. The shrike let out a pulse, a visible wave of indigo energy that expanded from its core. When the wave hit the Krell torpedoes, they didn't explode. They simply ceased to exist, their matter stripped down to subatomic dust in a fraction of a millisecond. The wave continued, washing over the Krell interceptors. The alien ships remained intact for a heartbeat before their internal structures collapsed into themselves, crushed by a localized gravity well so precise it left the surrounding space untouched. Elias felt the pulse pass through him. It didn't hurt. It felt like a low, vibrating hum in his marrow, a secret shared between the hunter and the witness. The Krell were gone, erased as if they had never been more than a smudge on a lens. Silence returned, heavier than before. The shrike began to move, its colossal fins banking with a slow, deliberate grace. It wasn't drifting anymore. It was positioning itself, its massive form casting a shadow that covered the entirety of the dart. Elias scrambled back into the airlock, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. As he resealed the cabin and restored the dim emergency power, he looked out the viewport. The shrike was no longer ignoring the world. It was descending. It wasn't heading for the human fleet or the colonial cities. It was staying exactly 1 kilometer behind the dart, its massive eye focused on the small, flickering lights of the cockpit. Elias realized with a terrifying clarity that the predator wasn't the enemy, nor was it a savior of humanity. It was a companion that had found a single point of interest in a boring universe. He gripped the flight stick, his hands finally steady. He turned the dart back toward the planet, toward the coming storm of the Krell main fleet. Behind him, the stars disappeared as the shrike followed his every move, a moon-sized shadow that moved with the precision of a loyal hound. The war was coming, and for the first time in human history, the most dangerous thing in the galaxy wasn't fighting for a flag or a world. It was following a man. The descent into the atmosphere was a harrowing ballet of atmospheric friction and psychic weight. Elias steered the battered dart toward the landing spires of the Citadel, the primary military bastion on Aegis Prime, while the Void Shrike remained locked in his wake. Its passage through the ionosphere created a localized aurora, a shimmering curtain of violet and gold that blinded the planetary sensors and sent the global communication networks into a panicked frenzy. To the billions below, it looked as though the moon had decided to fall. To Elias, it felt like the heavy, silent breathing of a creature waiting for its master to speak. The hangar bay was a fortress of pointed barrels and shimmering kinetic shields when Elias finally touched down. He barely had time to cycle the airlock before a squad of power-armored MPs surrounded the ship, their heavy pulse rifles leveled at his chest. Behind them stood General Vance, a man whose face was a topographic map of cold pragmatism and decades of uncompromising command. Vance didn't look like a man who had just witnessed a miracle. He looked like a man who had found a leak in his hull and intended to plug it with whatever was closest. "Commander Thorne, you will step away from the vessel and keep your hands visible." Vance's voice boomed over the hangar's intercom, stripped of its usual bravado. The general's eyes kept darting upward toward the reinforced transparent steel ceiling, through which the colossal amber eye of the shrike was visible, hovering directly over the hangar like a predatory sun. Elias complied, his movements stiff from the lingering radiation of the void. He was marched not to a medical bay, but to a high-security interrogation suite buried deep within the Citadel's basalt foundations. The room was a sterile box of white light and dampening fields, designed to nullify telepathic resonance and electronic eavesdropping alike. Vance sat across from him, the table between them a projection of the current orbital theater. "Explain it, Elias," Vance commanded, leaning forward until the harsh light caught the silver of his rank pins. "The Krell are regrouping at the edge of the system. They've lost a scouting wing, but their main force, the Sun Eaters, is still coming. And we have a moon-sized apex predator sitting on our chimney because of you. Is it a weapon? A Trojan horse? Or did you just decide to lead the apocalypse to our doorstep?" "It's none of those things, General," Elias replied, his voice sounding thin and alien in the muffled room. The Shrike doesn't recognize our flags. It doesn't understand the hegemony or the CDF. It spent eons drifting through the silence because it found nothing that resonated with its own existence. It didn't follow me because I'm a commander. It followed me because I was the first thing in this sector that didn't try to consume it or flee from it. It's not a weapon. It's an observer that has finally decided to participate. Vance slammed a fist onto the table, shattering the holographic display. Participation is for soldiers. We need to know how to steer it. If we can't control it, we have to kill it before the Krell arrive. We've already authorized the activation of the God Killer, the relativistic kill vehicle in the subterranean silos. If that thing moves an inch closer to the capital, I'm vaporizing it and you with it. A sudden, sharp tremor rocked the citadel, deep and rhythmic, like the beating of a titan's heart. The lights in the interrogation room flickered and died, replaced by a low, pulsing amber glow that seemed to seep through the very walls. Elias felt a surge of cold terror, not for himself but for the men in the silos. He knew the Shrike wasn't just hovering, it was tasting the intent of the city below. It could feel the God Killer being fueled. Could smell the aggression. "General, listen to me," Elias whispered, the resonance in his teeth returning with a vengeance. "If you fire that missile, you aren't just attacking a beast. You're confirming every reason it had to ignore us for 1,000 years. It isn't defending the planet, it's defending the only thing it values. Meh. If you turn this city into a threat to my life, it will erase Aegis Prime just to keep the silence." Vance reached for his comlink, his face set in a mask of stubborn defiance. "I don't take orders from pets, Thorn. Silo 1, this is Vance. Target the anomaly. Fire on my mark." The air in the room suddenly ionized, smelling of ozone and ancient dust. Elias felt a scream building in his throat, not a human sound, but a psychic echo of the Shrike's own rising agitation. Before Vance could give the final order, the base-wide sirens transitioned from the low moan of a planetary alert to the frantic high-pitched shriek of an incoming orbital strike. The Krell had bypassed the outer rim defenses. A single, obsidian spike, a Krell planet cracker, had dropped out of warp directly above the citadel. It was a suicide run, a weapon designed to detonating upon impact with the atmosphere, scouring the surface of all life. The human defenses were too slow, the God Killer was pointed at the wrong target. Elias looked at Vance, whose hand was frozen over the comlink. In that moment, the hierarchy of the military crumbled under the weight of a true apex. Elias closed his eyes and reached out with his mind, projecting a single desperate image of the obsidian spike and the fire it carried. He didn't ask for a miracle, he simply shared his fear. Outside, the sky didn't just dim, it vanished. The Shrike, which had been a passive observer, suddenly inverted its colors, its iridescent scales turning a matte, terrifying black. It moved with a speed that defied its mass, positioning its gargantuan body directly between the citadel and the falling Krell spike. The impact didn't produce a sound. Instead, there was a flash of indigo light that turned the night into a brilliant, haunting day. When the light faded, the Krell spike was gone, its mass absorbed into the Shrike's hide like a raindrop into an ocean. Vance slumped into his chair, the comlink clattering to the floor. The Shrike hadn't saved the city because it cared for the millions within it. It had caught the bullet because the bullet was aimed at the room where Elias Thorn sat. The realization was more terrifying than the invasion itself. Humanity wasn't an ally to this god, it was merely the cage housing its only interest. As the Krell main fleet finally emerged from the dark, blotting out the stars, Elias knew the real slaughter was about to begin, and he was the only one holding the leash of a storm. The transition from being a prisoner to being a catalyst was seamless and cold. Elias Thorn sat in the cockpit of a refurbished long-range interceptor, the Vanguard one, feeling the rhythmic thrum of the engines through his flight suit. Outside the reinforced canopy, the sky of Aegis Prime was no longer visible, obscured by the monolithic underbelly of the Shrike. The creature had remained in a state of hypervigilant stasis since the destruction of the Krell spike, its vast, crystalline hide pulsing with a rhythmic, low-frequency hum that disrupted every electronic device within a 10-mile radius. General Vance and the remaining CDF High Command had reached a grim consensus. Humanity could not control the beast, but they could point the man it followed toward the heart of the enemy. The departure was not a military formation, it was an exodus. 300 human destroyers and cruisers trailed at a respectful distance, their captains ordered to hold fire unless Elias gave the signal. They were the scavengers following a Leviathan. As Elias punched the coordinates for the Krell's primary staging ground, the binary star system of Orus. The Shrike didn't wait for a warp drive to engage. It simply folded the space in front of its prow, a shimmering tear in reality that swallowed the Vanguard 1 and the entity together. The human fleet followed through the collapsing wake, their hulls groaning under the unnatural gravitational shear. Emerging into the Orus system was like stepping into a furnace of obsidian and dying light. The Krell Sun-Eater fleet was a nightmare of industrial scale, thousands of needle ships and mobile fortresses swarming around a dying red giant. They had been harvesting the star's energy to fuel their final push toward Earth, but the arrival of the Shrike changed the calculus of the war instantly. The Krell did not hesitate. They were a collective consciousness driven by a cold, entropic logic, and they recognized the Shrike as a singular threat to their grand design. 10,000 plasma lances ignited simultaneously, turning the void into a web of lethal, searing red energy. Elias pushed his interceptor into a high G turn, his vision tunneling as the inertial dampeners struggled to keep pace. He wasn't aiming for the ships, he was aiming for the heart of the Sun-Eater array. He felt the Shrike's presence behind him, a vast, comforting shadow that absorbed the stray fire meant for his small craft. The creature remained eerily passive, its iridescent scales shimmering as it drifted through the barrage. It was waiting for a signal, a moment of true extremity. Elias realized with a sickening jolt of clarity that the Shrike wouldn't act out of strategic necessity, it would only act when the bond was threatened. He was the bait in a cosmic trap. The Krell realized this too. A squadron of phase shifters, ships capable of flickering in and out of local reality, bypassed the Shrike's gravity well and converged on Elias. They didn't use long-range beams. They used localized spatial shears designed to tear a hull apart at the molecular level. The Vanguard 1 shuddered as a shear caught its starboard wing, the metal screaming as it twisted into impossible geometries. Elias fought the controls, but the ship was dying. Life support failed, and the cockpit filled with the biting scent of scorched wiring and recycled air. "This is Thorn," he gasped into the comms, though he knew the human fleet was still light seconds away, struggling with the Krell Vanguard. "I'm hit. Mayday. I'm going down." He didn't look at his instruments. He looked back at the Shrike. The creature's primary eye, that swirling amber galaxy, was no longer calm. It began to vibrate, a sound that transcended the vacuum and echoed in Elias's very soul. The matte black color that had appeared during the defense of the citadel now spread like a viral infection across the Shrike's entire kilometer-long body. The iridescent scales didn't just turn dark. They sharpened, extending into jagged, obsidian blades that hummed with the energy of 1,000 suns. The transformation was visceral and terrifying. The Shrike ceased to be an observer and became a hurricane of dark matter. It didn't fire weapons, it simply moved. In a blur of motion that defied the laws of mass, the creature lunged forward. A Krell fortress ship, a vessel that had survived centuries of galactic conquest, was sliced in half by the mere passage of the Shrike's ventral fin. The resulting explosion was silenced by the Shrike's own gravitational wake. The debris sucked into the creature's hide and converted into raw kinetic energy. Elias's ship began a terminal tumble toward the gravity well of the Orus sun. Through the spinning viewport, he saw the Shrike unleash its full, unbridled fury. It was a ballet of absolute destruction. The Krell fleet, once a coordinated wall of death, was being shredded like paper in a turbine. The Shrike was no longer ignoring the armies. It was hunting them with a precision that bordered on the sadistic. Every time a Krell ship attempted to lock onto Elias's falling interceptor, the Shrike was there, erasing the threat before it could even discharge its energy. As the heat of the red sun began to blister the paint on his hull, Elias felt a strange telepathic pull. The Shrike wasn't just killing the Krell, it was screaming. A psychic roar of possessive rage filled his mind, a declaration that this tiny fragile spark of life belonged to the void, and the void would burn the universe to keep it. The Vanguard 1 hit the upper thermosphere of the sun's corona, and Elias braced for the end, his hand reaching out toward the glass as if to touch the great amber eye one last time. Instead of fire, he felt a sudden, profound stillness. The Shrike had reached out, its massive crystalline hand, a protrusion of hardened gravity, wrapping around the interceptor just as the hull began to melt. The creature held him with the tenderness of a mother and the grip of a singularity. Elias looked out and saw the Krell homeworld in the distance, its defenses shattered, its sun-eaters silenced. The predator had finally followed him into the heart of the fire, and as the two of them hung suspended over the boiling surface of the star, Elias knew that the galaxy would never be the same. The hunt was over, and the era of the Protector had begun. The cabin of the Vanguard 1 was a tomb of dying electronics, illuminated only by the rhythmic amber pulse of the eye that filled his entire viewport. Elias Thorne felt the absolute stillness of the gravity well, a pocket of sanctuary carved out of the chaotic, boiling furnace of the Orus sun. Outside that shimmering barrier, the Krell's Sun-Eater array was shattering, its obsidian spires melting into rivers of slag under the shrike's silent, overwhelming proximity. He was a creature of flesh and bone held in the palm of a singularity, yet he felt no fear. The terror that had defined his career as a soldier had evaporated, replaced by a profound, haunting clarity. He was no longer just a commander of men. He was the anchor for a consciousness that had found its first reason to care. The silence was broken by a screech of static from his emergency broadcast frequency. It was the Krell core mind, a synthesized, discordant chorus of 1,000 voices screaming in a final, desperate defiance. They had realized that the shrike could not be broken by force, so they had opted for the ultimate entropic spite. The Sun-Eater array wasn't just melting, it was reversing its polarity. They were forcing the red giant into a premature supernova, intending to trigger a gravitational collapse that would birth a black hole. It was a scorched earth gambit designed to swallow the shrike, the human fleet, and the entire Orus system in one final vengeful bite. Elias watched the star's surface heave and darken, the fiery orange gas turning into a bruised, violent purple. The shrike's grip on his ship tightened. He could feel the creature's confusion through the mental link, a flicker of uncertainty in a mind that had never known a predator of its own. The shrike was powerful, but it was a creature of space and matter, not a force that could ignore the birth of a singularity. Elias leaned forward, his forehead pressing against the cold glass of the cockpit, his mind reaching out to the swirling amber abyss of the shrike's eye. "Don't run," Elias whispered, the words vibrating through the telepathic hum. "Don't leave them." He wasn't talking about the human fleet, which was already desperately trying to jump to warp. He was talking about the billions of lives on the frontier worlds that would be extinguished by the shockwave of a collapsing star. Elias didn't offer a tactical plan or a military maneuver. He shared a memory, the smell of rain on Aegis Prime, the laughter of soldiers in a quiet barracks, and the simple, fragile beauty of a life that was finite. He showed the shrike that the true power of an apex was not the ability to destroy, but the strength to endure the unendurable for the sake of another. The star began to fold. A ring of blinding white light erupted from the corona as the core collapsed, the vacuum of the newborn black hole beginning to tear at the edges of reality. The shrike did not flee. Instead, it did something that defied every law of xenobiology and physics. It expanded. The kilometer-long creature began to unravel its own crystalline structure, its matte black scales lengthening into vast, shimmering filaments of dark matter. It wove itself into a web, a gargantuan net of bioorganic energy that draped itself over the collapsing star like a shroud. Elias felt a surge of agony that wasn't his own. It was the shrike's pain, the sensation of a godlike entity being flayed by the gravity of a dying sun. The creature was absorbing the explosion, using its own body as a dampener to contain the supernova. The amber light in the shrike's eye flared with the intensity of 1,000,000,000 candles before fading into a dull, exhausted glow. For a terrifying minute, the universe seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a soundless implosion, the light vanished. The star was gone, replaced not by a black hole, but by a cold, stable cinder of a white dwarf, its destructive potential spent against the shrike's indomitable hide. The filaments retracted, the shrike's body slowly knitting itself back into its jagged, monolithic form. It was scarred now, its scales cracked and its iridescence dimmed, but it remained. It drifted toward the vanguard one, which was still miraculously intact. The creature didn't need to communicate in words. The way it positioned itself, shielding Elias from the radiation of the new star, spoke of a bond that had transcended the roles of master and pet. Months later, the war was officially declared over. The Krell, their core minds shattered and their fleets erased, had retreated into the lightless voids between galaxies. Aegis Prime had become the new capital of a revitalized human federation, a world that stood as a testament to a victory no one had expected. But Elias Thorne was not at the victory parades. He sat on the porch of a modest cabin on the planet's highest plateau, his mechanical hand resting on his knee as he watched the sun set. General Vance had offered him every medal the military could forge, but Elias had declined. He knew that his presence at the Citadel would only serve as a reminder of a power humanity could never truly control. He was a man who lived in the shadow of a god. He looked up as the first stars began to pierce the twilight. High in the atmosphere, visible even to the naked eye, was a star that didn't twinkle. It was a massive, dark silhouette that stayed in a fixed orbit, its single amber eye staring down at the plateau with a patient, eternal vigil. The galaxy had learned to fear the predator, but humanity had learned to love the protector. Elias closed his eyes, feeling the low, rhythmic hum in his teeth that told him he was never truly alone. The shrike had ignored entire armies because they were noise, but it followed one human because he had been a signal in the dark. As long as Elias Thorne drew breath, the apex would stand guard, a silent sentinel for a species that had finally found its place among the stars. The predator had found its anchor, and the soldier had finally found his peace.